We are at the start. The board is empty. In this moment, all games are possible. Every chance happening happens. Every possibility is true. Stay here a moment, because this perfect condition will not return until the game is ended.
Hi there, my name's Jim. Welcome to my living room. Now this video is intended to serve a dual purpose. Firstly, it is intended to introduce a live artwork that I've been working on, something that we've presented a version of and that I'm building into a more substantial piece. This is called A History of Fate, and it's based on a 5,000-year-old board game called the Royal Game of Ur. Now I'll tell you a bit more about that in a moment. The other purpose of this video is for people who might not be so interested in my art practice, but who might be subscribers to this channel, to explain why I haven't been uploading videos recently. It's because I've been working on this. Now, the Royal Game of Ur is amazing. It is a board game from ancient Mesopotamia that was played and was popular for hundreds of years, and it travelled across different cultures. Boards have been found in Cyprus, in Egypt, and kind of all across the ancient world, spreading out from Mesopotamia in a kind of a cultural exchange. It began as a street game, not too dissimilar to backgammon. It's a race game where you move pieces around the board in an attempt to get all your pieces around the board before your opponent does. It's quite a simple game really, but what's interesting about it is it began as a street game. It became so popular that it was eventually played by kings and scholars. We found it in kind of royal chambers and things like that. And one of the things that's most fascinating about it is the meaning that became added onto the game over time. So it eventually became used in a kind of educational context to kind of explain principles, mathematical principles, but even as a tool for exposition around philosophical ideas, such as the nature of chance, for instance. And so it was used to kind of explore quite complex ideas.
They had a conception in Mesopotamia of fate and destiny, and the extent to which your life was prescribed and the extent to which you were independent, and they taught things like this in school. They discussed philosophical matters, and they used this game board obviously partly to talk about the influence of fate, and presumably about scores and numbers and what difference it makes if you... So it wasn't just something they did at lunch, but it was a focus for exposition. It's a very, very remarkable thing.
Perhaps you realise that choosing when to move requires wisdom. Whatever fate has in store for this game, it waits on the choices you make. Destiny awaits your command. Have you lingered too long in life? Roll the dice. Another piece has been taken. Yet another act of violence. The game lengthens.
Eventually, the game began to be used in some places as a form of fortune telling, and the pieces, the spaces on the board that you landed on began to grow in this kind of, had this layered on meaning that would be used to predict things about the player and about their future. Now the rules for this game were lost for millennia. So for a long time, archaeologists had the board and lots of examples of the board, different variations of the board with different decorations and slightly different layouts, but nobody knew how to play it. And in the same way as with the ancient game when it was in use, meaning began to be layered on. So scholars would look at the board, look at other games that were around at the time, and perhaps looking at backgammon and other games that have descended from the Royal Game of Ur, and they would try and guess and reconstruct how the game was played. And there are many, many variations of people's guesses of how this game was played. However, in the 80s, the cuneiform tablet was discovered in the British Museum. It was translated by an amazing curator named Dr. Irving Finkel, who found that on this tablet was a discussion of the game written by an astronomer noting correspondences between the game and movements in the heavens. And so from this text, we've been able to reconstruct the rules for the Royal Game of Ur.
A piece is taken. The board is made easier to navigate. Both sides take a second to recognize how this moment feels. It's such a brief action in the course of the whole game, but a story begins here. The strength of one player is revealed, and a desire for revenge is seated, invisibly, in the other.
I was also really fascinated by this layering on of meaning that accrued over time. And sometimes that's just because this thing had been in the culture for so long that it began to gather meaning and gather significance. Or later on, the game gathered significance in the fact that we knew so little about it, and so we projected ideas onto it. It's interesting how in both instances the game seems to have picked up a kind of mystical significance and quality. The artwork which resulted from this game and this idea was A History of Fate. Now, it is a human-scaled version of the board game. It measures about 5.5 meters by 2.5, something like that. So it's a huge board where people can walk around on the tiles of the board representing game pieces. Each piece carried a stick like this, so there was 4 black sticks, 4 red sticks, and you'd progress around the board holding one of these sticks. As instructed by the player who is rolling the dice and members of the audience who are encouraged to call out suggestions and things like that.
The first rosette. Another pawn is poised to leave the protection of early life, ready to strike out and make a break towards the end of the board. Roll again. A piece is taken. A violent action. Was this behaviour latent within the player or forced by the circumstances of the game? By the time this story ends, I don't suppose it will be a distinction that matters.
One of the things that is interesting about playing the game live is that having humans as the game pieces lent this extra level of significance, and you felt betrayed when your piece was taken. The second part of making this game into an artwork is more about than just making it giant sized. I was also interested in bringing in this idea of using the game as a focus for philosophical exposition and as a lens through which to think about future and the whole fortune telling thing. So the piece is called A History of Fate, and what happens while you're playing the game is certain dice rolls and certain actions with the game will trigger a disembodied voice to speak, and this voice comes over the speakers and says something about the game which perhaps you could interpret to also be something about what it means to be a person living. So is he describing the game, or is he describing a life? Is he describing actions happening in this particular discrete game, or is he referring to something about the player or something about the person representing a game piece. It's not quite clear. And I liked the idea of creating this kind of mysterious situation where people were invited to read in and were invited to, I would put it like this, to encourage a kind of wider spiritual consciousness, which sounds a bit airy-fairy. But what I mean by that is this, it's encouraging people to think beyond the mundane, beyond what is directly represented in front of them, i.e. a board game, and see whether there is something beyond that, something behind that that could be instructive to us as human beings. So that's kind of inspired a little bit by the Mesopotamian worldview and consciousness, which is this. They lived in a world that they believed was populated by many unseen spirits, gods, demons, who not only were present in the real world, but had an active role in our lives, affected everyday people. It was a way of explaining and understanding the unexplainable and calamities that happen for seemingly no reason. There was some then therefore explanation for it through the use of this kind of spiritual perception.
A piece has landed on a rosette, affording you another roll. If you can find it, life has a rhythm, a beat you can find that will expedite your pawn's journey. Roll again. The thrill and horror as another pawn is scattered back to the start. It has to be this way. This is what it means to play.
So I had this idea to create an artwork based on the Royal Game of Ur, which was a giant version of the game where this voiceover would come in, affected by the players' dice rolls and the moves that they took to say these strange, portentous things. And each time the game was played, that voice would be different, triggered by different events, and everyone would receive a kind of unique version of the game. In order to develop this idea, I applied to the Marlow Theatre's RAW programme and was accepted, which was amazing. This gave me the opportunity to spend a week's R&D, although I actually probably spent quite a bit longer time making stuff and things, in order to create a kind of proto version of this idea, and it went amazingly. The most interesting thing about performing the work was that there began to be a really interesting relationship between the voice, which was in this instance played by an amazing actor named Ben Roddy, and myself, who was on the ground acting as the facilitator. So I was speaking to the audience, passing them the dice, explaining the rules, and acting as a kind of, person in the real world. And then there was this voice that came in, and there was a couple of points where there was this interesting interaction and a difference between our two positions and perspectives that I think had something rich about it that I would like to explore further in developments of this project.
You have given yourselves over to brutality. But can that be your own fault when the conditions are set up this way? You are locked in this cycle until one of you can break through.